Hey, everybody. So I know that I won't have a chance to get through the rest of chapter 10 in class. So we have time for chapter 20. And I thought I'd make a video showing you the end of chapter 10. Once we get done in class, that's really the hard material. And the rest of the chapter is just some good information. Some of it's on the test, of course. So I'm going to start right after where we finish in class. And in class, we were talking about this contraction cycle that the muscle does. And I went through the entire process in class. And so we're going to start here with this slide about rigor mortis. This is slide number 28. And talk about rigor mortis and how our contraction cycle affects this process during death called rigor mortis. So rigor mortis is a continuous state of contraction of the muscles after death. It usually begins anywhere from 3 to 72 hours after death. And the reason for this all has to do with calcium. You see those sarcoplasmic reticulum in the cells or in the muscle fibers are holding calcium, and they pump calcium with ATP. They pump calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Well, once death occurs, there's no more ATP production. So there's no more calcium pumps pumping that calcium into the sarcolemma. So the calcium floods out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and just floods the sarcomere. Now, what happens is this opens up the cross bridge between the actin myosin, just like normal. And there's one more ATP that's energized that myosin. So what happens is we have one more power stroke, and there's no more ATP to jump on that myosin to break the actin from the myosin. So the muscle stays in that perpetual contraction. So imagine this. Imagine we have the sarcomere. Calcium comes down, opens up the troponin, allowing for the actin myosin to bind together. There's one more ATP that allows a power stroke. And we have that power stroke. But remember, during that contraction cycle, another ATP has to jump on the myosin to relax it and break it free so that we can do it again. This doesn't occur after death because there's no more ATP. So the sarcomere just slides and is stuck incompletely, and the contraction cycle is stuck. Now, this is rigor mortis. So this will stay until at the bottom bullet there, until bacteria nibble the myosin heads off as they start decomposition, and then the body will relax again. And so this is why a body gets stiff, and then why it relaxes again several days later. Bacteria start to decompose those myosin heads, and they eat them off, and then the body relaxes again. So I just wanted to share rigor mortis with you because it's a good example of how this contraction cycle works and what happens when we don't have ATP. You know, on a lesser scale, this is how we cramp too. So when you get a muscle cramp, it's usually because your muscles get fatigued. There's not enough ATP to keep that muscle contraction cycle going. So the muscles just stay contracted. The actin myosin slide, we get the power stroke, and then there's no ATP to relax those muscles. And so you get a cramp. Same thing. Like, I guess rigor mortis is the ultimate cramp. All right. Next is relaxation. Now, I mentioned this in class, but relaxation is going to be caused by acetylcholinesterase. And acetylcholinesterase is an enzyme that binds to acetylcholine, stops acetylcholine from being the key that opens up the sodium channels and relaxes the muscle. When the muscle relaxes, calcium is shipped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. But there's a huge concentration gradient that we're pumping against. That's why rigor mortis occurs, is because after death, the muscles are unable to keep that calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and so it floods out. But under normal circumstances with a living muscle, we pump that calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, there are proteins called calsequestrin that will help hold that calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And look at that. It says that the sarcoplasmic reticulum can hold up to 10,000 times more calcium than the cell cytoplasm. And so that's crazy. Now, if there's no calcium present, that troponin covers up the site where the actin and myosin want to bind. And so we have no more muscle contraction. We have muscle relaxation. All right, slide 30. We're still talking about contractions. Now, it's important to understand that the action potential is an all or none process. It either happens or it doesn't. We can't have like a strong action potential that is more forceful and a weaker one that's less forceful. They just happen. But obviously, you can control the strength of your muscle contraction. All right. Now, the way that we control the muscle contraction strength, whether we're picking up something that's 100 pounds or something like a pencil, there's a big difference in the strength of the contraction. So your muscles can vary based on the need of the strength. Well, this is done by motor units. Motor units innervate our muscle fibers. So what we can do is we can send an action potential to several to many motor units. Now, the part of the muscle that receives that signal is going to contract. We can't change that, but we can change how many motor units are affected by the action potential. So let's say you've got, half of your motor units sending signals to half of your muscle fibers. You're going to have a moderate muscle contraction. If you've got to pick up something really heavy, you might innervate all of your motor units. And that's going to allow all your muscle fibers to receive an action potential, which is going to cause all of them to contract. So the strength of contraction depends on the motor units. And it says it's graded for whole muscles. So it says the strength of contractions range from weak to strong depending on the stimulus strength. So in other words, depending on how many motor units send action potentials to your muscle. So picking up a pencil, you may just use, 10% of your motor units. Picking up a 100-pound bag of concrete, you may innervate all your motor units. So this is how we can vary the strength of the muscle contraction. All right, now we have different types of muscle contractions. And this is more exercise physiology. So for those of you that are into physical therapy or, things like the exercise physiology, this stuff you're probably familiar with. So an example of it would be isometric versus isotonic exercises. So isometric is no change in length, but our tension increases. Muscles of our posture do this all the time. A good isometric exercise would be when you press against a wall and put your knees at 90 degrees. you see the muscles aren't changing their length, but the tension of the muscles is there. That exercise is called isometric. Now, when you're doing like bicep curls or bench press, those exercises are what we call isotonic. Isotonic exercises is where we change the length of the muscle, but the tension remains the same. So when you do a bicep curl, you're going to change the length of your muscle, but the tension, the weight is going to stay the same. So you might have a 20-pound dumbbell. That's the tension. It remains constant, but you're changing the length of that muscle. And as we do a bicep curl, the first part of the bicep curl is concentric, where the muscle shortens. And then as we put the dumbbell down, we extend that biceps brachii muscle, and that's eccentric. So there's two parts of an isotonic exercise. When you shorten the muscle and bend your elbow during a bicep curl, that's concentric. And then when you straighten your elbow out to do another rep, that's eccentric. Now, the better our muscles are at keeping tension, the better our muscle tone is. So muscle tone is that constant tension by our muscles for a long period of time. You know, if you've ever gone to the gym and you like work out really well, and when you leave, it feels like your muscles are still contracted, that's muscle tone. So just something to think about there. Now, because our muscles are using ATP, they're going to fatigue. And so there are several different types of fatigue. Fatigue is the decreased capacity to work. So our muscles just don't work as well as they get fatigued. Now, there are really two ways that our muscles are really hindered by fatigue. The first one is psychological, and the second one is muscular. These are the two most common. So psychological fatigue depends on your emotional state. So, you know, like if you're all up and excited about your exercise, you have a good mental outlook, you tend to do better. That day where you just feel like, I really don't want to exercise today, you're psychologically down, it can make it harder for you to do those same exercises. Think of like sports. You know, I think of football a lot. The emotional state of an individual can raise you up or let you down. You know, like a football team can be doing really well and then they fumble the ball. So psychologically they get down, and then it just seems like they're fatigued. Seems kind of dumb, but it works with me with butterfly collecting. You know, I'll be like trudging up a mountain. I'll be really tired. And my emotional state, I'm like, oh, I haven't seen a butterfly in, 20 minutes. Why am I doing this? This really sucks. So you're getting tired, more fatigued. And then I see that butterfly that I've been looking for, and I see it flying amongst the grass, and my emotional state kicks into high gear, and I get excited. My physiological fatigue diminishes, and I feel like I have more energy as I chase after that butterfly. The most common type of fatigue that you think of is muscular fatigue. Obviously, we run out of ATPs. So when our muscles are running low on ATP, we can get cramps, we can fatigue, and our muscles become more and more inefficient. That's due to ATP. There is a rare type of fatigue called synaptic fatigue, where it's really a genetic disorder where a person's not making the correct acetylcholine. Remember, acetylcholine is that enzyme, not the enzyme, I'm sorry. It's that neurotransmitter that opens up sodium channels. So if you don't have acetylcholine, you can't have muscle contractions. And so if acetylcholine is missing, you have a synaptic fatigue, which is very rare, and it's a genetic disorder. All right, moving along. The last thing about skeletal muscles is slow and fast twitch fibers. Believe it or not, we actually have muscle fibers that are what we call high oxidative or low oxidative. High oxidative fibers are what we call slow twitch fibers, and they are fatigue resistant. So they can carry on their contractions much longer than the low oxidative fast twitch fibers. So slow twitch fibers, when we think of like a bird, they are the dark meat of a bird. So just think of a chicken or a turkey. You know, the turkey legs, the turkey wings, they're what we call dark meat. The reason why they're dark meat is because they are made of slow twitch muscle fibers. They're fatigue resistant and they can work over long periods of time. The fast twitch fibers can respond really quick to get us out of a bad situation, but they fatigue quickly. So they're called fast twitch fibers because they can react fast, but they don't have a resistance to fatigue. So they get tired really quickly. This is typically what we call white meat on a turkey. So, you know, like if you're thinking about, you know, the breast and back of a turkey, that's made of white meat. The legs and wings are made out of dark meat. So, you know, you don't want your wings getting tired. So they're fatigue resistant. But other muscles, like in the breast and back, they can react quick, but they get tired fast. So there, we do have slow and fast twitch fibers. Now, the distribution between these fast and slow twitch fibers are in each of the human muscles. So it varies from muscle to muscle. Like we have more slow twitch fibers in our arms and legs and more fast twitch fibers in our torso, you know, chest and back. But it's more evenly distributed than like a chicken. So it's harder to say. It's like, you know, if you're eating the pilot when you're stuck in the Andes after a plane crash, you can't be thinking, okay, I like the dark meat better than I like the light meat. So let's see, I'm going to have a little biceps brachii. That's dark meat. Yeah, you know, I guess humans do have that to some extent, but it's not as differentiated as like a turkey. All right, now don't forget to, I'm not sure why this is on this slide, but it says effects of exercise. Just don't forget that hypertrophy means growth. Atrophy is a wasting away or a shrinking of a muscle. All right, so that kind of takes care of our skeletal muscle. All right, so let's wrap up this chapter. I'm not going to make a second video. I'm just going to keep going. We're going to wrap up this chapter talking a little bit about smooth muscle, and then I'll touch on cardiac muscle, but that's what chapter 20 is, right? So let's look at the end of this chapter. So smooth muscle is very different than skeletal muscle, all right? It's not striated. It doesn't have Z discs. It doesn't have the sarcomere. It does use calcium to contract, but it doesn't have those actin and myosin myofilaments. It has fibers that can contract, but they're not actin and myosin. Now, as we go through more of the class, we'll talk a little bit about smooth muscle in other chapters, but there are two main types of smooth muscle. There's visceral, which means organ. So remember, smooth muscle is the muscle that's in our organs. These muscles function as a unit. So like your entire stomach functions as a unit. Your blood vessels function as a unit. And then we have what are called multi-unit smooth muscle, where we have individual cells that can act as independent units. And so some of these smooth muscles in glands, for example, or in your skin can be these multi-unit smooth muscles. So smooth muscles are autorhythmic. You don't have to think consciously about them for them to work. They do receive signals from our nervous system, but it's involuntary. So it says smooth muscle tends to contract in response to a stretch reflex. So what happens is smooth muscle is going to contract when that muscle is stretched. Perfect example of this is your esophagus. Your esophagus, when you eat food, you swallow the food. There's smooth muscle in the esophagus that actually pushes the food to your stomach. It's not gravity that moves food. It is autorhythmic contractions of your esophagus. But what triggers those automatic contractions is that the food, when you swallow it, it stretches the esophagus. So the muscle of your esophagus stretches, and that causes this series of contractions that push the food down. So it says that smooth muscle has a constant, relatively constant tension. You have smooth muscle tone. And the amplitude, the strength of the contraction always remains constant. So, when you swallow food, every time you swallow food and you have muscle contractions in your esophagus, it's going to be the same as the contraction before it. Now, can we manipulate smooth muscle contractions? Yes. And that's what oxytocin does. So when a woman's having a baby, a small amount of oxytocin can cause a small amount of contractions in the uterus. The uterus has smooth muscle. The more oxytocin, the more smooth muscle in the uterus is affected, so we get a stronger and stronger and stronger contraction. The contractions that each cell does itself, though, is constant. We're just adding more and more and more cells that are contracting to cause the contraction amplitude to apparently increase. All right. Now, smooth muscle is regulated by the autonomic nervous system. So your unconscious nervous system is regulating smooth muscle. They do use neurotransmitters like acetylcholine and others like norepinephrine, but they're at the neuromuscular junction. They're also really regulated, like I just mentioned, by hormones. So epinephrine, which is adrenaline, oxytocin, these hormones, gastrin in our stomach, these hormones can cause smooth muscle contraction. So they're often regulated by hormones, where your skeletal muscles are not regulated by hormones. All right, they're regulated by your nervous system. So it says receptors are present on the plasma membrane, which those hormones and neurotransmitters can bind to and cause the smooth muscle contraction. Just think of oxytocin and childbirth. Remember, the smooth muscle of the uterus has receptors that accept oxytocin, and that causes the muscle contraction. Woohoo! All right. Now, the last thing to mention is just cardiac muscle. And cardiac muscle is going to be chapter 20, so I'm not going to really cover this, but cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. Remember, it's striated, so that means it has actin, myosin, it has sarcomeres. It's different than our skeletal muscle because it only has one nucleus per muscle fiber, and it has these intercalated discs, which are just little connections in the plasma membrane that allow the heart muscle to talk to one another. All heart muscle is autorhythmic, and we'll talk about what a refractory period is in chapter 20. Cardiac muscle still uses calcium, but one thing about cardiac muscle is it doesn't fatigue. So it doesn't get tired. I know sometimes it feels like you have a tired heart, but that's actually in your brain. It's not your heart. So when you're emotionally down, that's not your heart. So just, oh, my heart. Well, your heart's just beating. Your heart actually does not have emotions. Your heart's just pumping blood. All of your emotions are in your brain. And we'll talk about that when we get into the nervous system, which is maybe my favorite chapters. So we'll get into just this chapter 20 during class, and then I'll probably have to make a video to finish up chapter 20 like this one. But last thing, aging on skeletal muscle. As we age, kind of a bummer, we can reduce our muscle mass, so you want to keep exercising as you get older. We have increased time to react, so our muscles don't receive signals as well as they used to from the nervous system. We get tired quicker. That's the reduction of stamina. It takes longer to recover. So, you like work in the garden all day. As a young person, it doesn't bother you. You just wake up the next morning, you rebound just fine. As we get older, we get stiff and sore, and we have to take it easy that next day. What's bummer is you never gain muscle fibers, but you can lose them as we get older. And we also lose some blood supply. capillaries in our muscles can decrease, and that allows for a decrease in our stamina, recovery time, and all that kind of stuff. So, basically what we do is we go from Arnold Schwarzenegger circa 1970 to the Governata in the year 2000. And so you can see as we age, we just have an effect on our muscles. So this, folks, takes care of our chapter 10. Where should I go like this? 10. All right, so I'll catch you in class, and don't forget to study. Study, study, study. Catch you later.